Okay, so lots of you have been asking for a deep dive into Voltaire's Candide.
And we found, I think, a pretty cool way to do it.
Yeah. We've got this transcript of a university lecture.
Like the kind students would use to get ready for, a big exam.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So think of this like your crash course on Candide. You get all the good structured stuff.
But none of the stress of an actual exam.
Yeah, no pressure.
So our mission today is we want to unpack some of the core ideas in Candide.
See where those ideas came from, back in the 18th century.
And then maybe even figure out why they still kind of resonate today.
Right, like what makes them relevant now. Okay, let's jump in.
So the 18th century, fascinating time, right?
Yeah, I mean, it was the age of reason, right? The Enlightenment.
Exactly. So just imagine this incredible energy,
Hmm.
like a real buzz around scientific discoveries.
Yeah, and you've got explorers going out, charting new territories.
And this real strong sense that humanity was on an upward trajectory, like constantly improving.
Right, like everything was moving in the right direction. So that's where you get this strong sense of optimism, right? This feeling that things are just going to keep getting better and better.
And a lot of that optimism was fueled by this philosophical idea, the idea that we were living in the best of all possible worlds.
Right, the best of all possible worlds. And there were some pretty influential thinkers pushing that idea.
Oh, yeah, like Shaftesbury, Leibniz,
Yeah.
even Alexander Pope was on board with that.
So if we kind of connect all of this to the bigger picture, what was at the core of this optimistic view?
Well, a very strong belief in a benevolent God, a creator who designed the universe, specifically for humanity.
So everything, even the stuff that seems bad on the surface.
Yeah, even the bad stuff, it had its place.
It was all part of this larger, perfect, divine plan.
Exactly.
But then, and the lecture transcript makes this really clear, reality kind of throws a wrench into things.
Right, because people kept running into these really tough philosophical questions.
Yeah, questions that just wouldn't go away.
Like if everything is so perfectly ordered, if there's this loving God, where does all the pain and death come from?
All the evil in the world. How do you square that with this idea of a benevolent creator and this perfect plan?
Exactly.
Yeah.
And that tension, that's where you start to see this rise in skepticism.
Right. People starting to question things.
And empiricist philosophers, and Voltaire was a big one, they started looking at the world in a much more critical way.
Okay, so empiricism, like based on observation.
Exactly. So Voltaire, he looks at what's actually happening.
Wars.
Disease.
Widespread suffering.
And he's like, wait a minute.
This doesn't really feel like the best of all possible worlds.
Right.
Okay, so that brings us to Candide. And the lecture is really clear that Voltaire wrote this specifically to express his skepticism.
Yeah. To poke holes in that whole best of all possible worlds idea.
It's like he's giving people a reality check, saying, hey, things might not be as rosy as you've been told.
Exactly. So what's interesting about Candide is what kind of story it actually is.
Yeah, because it's not your typical massive, like super long novel.
Right, it's too short for that.
And it's also got more meat on his bones than a regular short story.
Yeah, and the lecture calls it a philosophical tale, which I think is a pretty good fit.
Okay, so let's break that down a little bit. Why philosophical?
Well, because it's really engaging with those big questions, like the problem of evil that we just talked about.
Right, trying to make sense of suffering in the world.
But it's also a satire.
Oh, yeah. It definitely makes fun of stuff.
It's taking aim at societal norms,
Habits.
traditional religion, even the whole concept of a completely good and powerful God when you look at all the human suffering.
Right, like how can you have both?
The lecture makes this distinction that it's an indirect satire, which is key.
Okay, so indirect means...
It means Voltaire isn't standing there lecturing you, like wagging his finger.
He's not hitting you over the head with his message.
He's using these characters and their often ridiculous experiences to get his point across.
So it's making you think critically, but it's also funny.
Right. It's subversive. It sneaks up on you.
Okay, that's clever. Now, the lecture also mentions Candide as travel literature.
Right, which might seem a little strange at first.
Yeah, because when you think travel literature, you think, like guidebooks and stuff.
Right, but if we connect this to the bigger picture, think about Candide's constant journey. He's going across different countries, different continents.
And all over the place.
And travel literature has this really long history. The lecture mentions it goes all the way back to Herodotus.
Like ancient Greece.
Exactly. And it's all about encountering different cultures, different ways of life.
Okay, that makes sense. But the lecture also makes a really important distinction.
Oh, yeah. There's a difference between actual, factual travel writing
Like someone who's really gone to these places.
and imagined travel.
Okay, so like making stuff up.
Kind of. More like creating a fictional world to explore ideas.
Hmm.
And the lectures gives a perfect example. Thomas More's Utopia.
Right, utopia. Like this ideal society.
Exactly. And Voltaire was in good company there.
Oh, yeah.
The lecture mentioned some of his contemporaries, like Jonathan Swift with Gulliver's Travels.
Right, Gulliver's Travels.
And Dr. Johnson with Restless. They were both using travel narratives to critique their own societies.
So they weren't exactly writing glowing reviews of the places they visited.
Definitely not, even when those places were fictional.
Which brings us to this idea of Candide as anti-utopian or dystopian.
Right, because instead of finding these perfect societies, Candide just keeps stumbling from one awful situation to the next.
Yeah, it's like a parade of terrible things happening to him. Wars, natural disasters, enslavement. He sees it all.
So it's the opposite of utopia. It's dystopia. It flips the whole idea on its head.
Okay, so let's meet the main players in this very not utopian world.
Right. So first up, we have Candide himself.
Our protagonist.
The lecture describes him as innocent and naive, someone who just accepts Pangloss's optimistic teachings without question.
He's like a sponge soaking it all up.
And his name, Candide, it actually means frank and transparent.
Which makes sense because he's so open and trusting.
Exactly. That innocence is really important to the satire. He starts as this blank slate, then reality just keeps hitting him in the face.
It's like watching a car crash in slow motion.
Then you have Pangloss, Candide's tutor. He's basically the poster boy for that optimistic philosophy we've been talking about.
He's like optimism on steroids.
The lecture points out that Pangloss's teachings are presented with this almost comical level of exaggeration.
Yeah, like he's almost a caricature.
Right, which tells you right away that Voltaire's not buying it. He's not presenting Pangloss as some wise, admirable figure.
He's more like a parody.
Exactly. And then there's Cunegonde, Candide's love interest. And her experiences are, well, brutal.
Yeah, she goes through some really horrific stuff. Rape, enslavement, things that completely contradict Pangloss's insistence that everything's for the best.
The lecture really emphasizes the irony in her name, Cunegonde. It means the chaste one.
Which is just heartbreaking, given what she goes through.
Right. It's another layer of that shark satire that Voltaire's so good at.
So let's dig into Pangloss's optimistic philosophy a little bit. What are the key points here?
Okay, so Pangloss's core belief is that life is good.
Which, sounds nice in theory.
But his real sticking point is that we live in the best of all possible worlds.
That's the big one. And the guy can't stop name-dropping these big-name philosophers.
Right. Like Shaftesbury, Leibniz.
The lecture even mentions Wolff, who is a follower of Leibniz.
And, of course, Alexander Pope. He's always throwing their names around.
So what were these guys actually saying? How did they justify this idea of the best of all possible worlds?
Well, Pangloss, echoing these philosophers, would argue that any evil we see is just partial evil.
Partial evil? What does that even mean?
Their idea was that we humans, with our limited understanding, we just can't grasp the big picture.
God's plan is too vast for our tiny brains.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So what looks bad to us is actually just a necessary part of a larger design.
A design that's ultimately good.
Right.
Okay, so that brings us to the lecture's discussion of evil itself, because it makes this distinction between two types of evil.
Natural evil and moral evil.
Okay, so natural evil would be?
Things like earthquakes, storms, tsunamis.
Yeah.
Things outside of human control.
Acts of God, so to speak.
Right. And then moral evil would be?
The bad stuff we do to each other.
Exactly. War, murder, greed, cruelty.
And the Lisbon earthquake gets a special mention here.
Oh, yeah. Because that was a huge deal back then.
It was a massive earthquake that hit in 1755. Killed tens of thousands of people.
And it really shook people's faith in this whole optimistic worldview.
Because here you have this devastating natural disaster striking during a religious festival.
Talk about bad timing.
It really forced people to question how a loving God could allow something so horrific to happen.
Right. It challenged the whole idea of a benevolent God and a divinely ordered world.
And Candide, as the lecture points out, really doesn't shy away from showing us both kinds of evil. Candide's journey takes him through all sorts of terrible situations.
It's not just theoretical. It's in your face.
And the journey itself, the lecture emphasizes, is a really key idea here, not just the physical journey.
Right. Because Candide travels all over. Europe, South America. The lecture calls it the Muslim world, or what we know today as Turkey.
He gets around.
But it's also a philosophical journey. Candide's constantly trying to make sense of the world, trying to reconcile what he sees with what he's been taught.
And of course, it's not going well.
Not at all.
Now, the lecture brings up a really interesting storytelling technique that Voltaire uses.
Oh, yeah. The fictional translator, Dr. Ralph.
Dr. Ralph, the supposed German scholar who translated the story, why would Voltaire even bother with that?
Well, the lecture suggests it was a way to create some distance.
To protect himself.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Because Candide is pretty direct in its attacks on religious beliefs and societal norms.
It was controversial stuff.
By claiming it was just a translation, Voltaire had a bit of plausible deniability.
Like, hey, don't blame me. I'm just the messenger.
Right. And the portrayal of Dr. Ralph as kind of naive adds another layer of irony.
It's like Voltaire saying, don't take this too seriously. It's just what this clueless German guy wrote.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It's a clever way to be critical, but also maintain a bit of distance from the potentially dangerous ideas.
The lecture makes a big point about the irony in Candide.
It's everywhere.
That gap between Pangloss's ridiculously optimistic pronouncements and the horrible reality the characters are experiencing, it's often darkly funny, but it really drives home Voltaire's point.
And the lecture even mentions the idea of Dr. Ralph being an unreliable narrator.
Oh, that's interesting. So it can't even be sure if we're getting the whole truth.
Right. Which makes things even more complex.
So it all comes back to that central tension, right? This clash between optimistic beliefs and the undeniable evidence of suffering in the world.
And the lecture highlights Voltaire's own empiricist stance. His belief in what you can see and feel, as opposed to these abstract philosophical arguments.
He's basically saying, let's stop theorizing and look at what's actually happening.
Right.
So Pangloss, with his endless quoting of Shaftesbury, Pope, and Leibniz, he becomes the main target of Voltaire's critique.
And he's presented almost as a comical figure, which undermines the philosophy itself.
So let's revisit those philosophers, like the lecture does. What were their main ideas?
Okay, so Shaftesbury believed in the natural goodness of humanity.
Which, as Candide quickly learns, is not always the case.
Right. He sees a lot of cruelty and selfishness.
So that one kind of falls apart pretty quickly.
Then you have Alexander Pope. His big idea was this perfectly balanced world, like a giant clock where every part has its place.
And evil is just a result of our limited perspective.
Exactly. But Candide throws all these horrific events at that idea.
War, disease, natural disasters. It's like Voltaire saying, how does that fit into your perfect little clock?
Right. And then there's Leibniz. He had all these logical arguments for a benevolent, all-powerful God.
Which implies that we must be living in the best of all possible worlds.
But as the lecture points out, the Lisbon earthquake alone seems to contradict that pretty strongly.
Like, how could a loving God allow so much suffering? It just doesn't add up.
Exactly. It's that impossible contradiction that Voltaire keeps hammering home.
Okay, so something the lecture emphasizes is the significant role that female characters play in Candide, which is interesting because for the time period, it's a little unusual.
It is. And the lecture makes a point of saying that these women are given a prominent place specifically to recount their suffering.
They're not just background characters, they have a voice.
And Cunegonde's narration in Chapter 8 is a really good example of that.
Yeah, Cunegonde, Candide's love interest, who goes through, some truly horrific stuff.
She tells the story of the beginning of the book from her perspective.
Filling in the gaps.
And detailing her rape and enslavement.
It's really tough to read, but it's important.
The lecture points out how this gives us a personal, visceral look at social injustices.
And not just within traditional Catholic societies.
Right. It also highlights the injustices against marginalized groups, women, Protestants, intellectuals, Jewish people.
Cunegonde experiences it all.
And it leads her to completely reject Pangloss's optimistic views.
She's seen too much to believe that everything's for the best.
And then you have the old woman, whose story comes in chapters 11 and 12.
She's got a pretty harrowing tale, too.
Years of misery and enslavement across continents.
It just reinforces that theme of relentless suffering, like there's no escaping it.
And then there's Paquette in chapter 24. Her experiences are another reality check for Candide, who's still clinging to some of that naive optimism.
He's a slow learner.
But Paquette sets him straight.
The lecture makes this really powerful statement about these female characters. It calls their stories history from the point of view of its victims.
It's giving a voice to those who are so often silenced or ignored in traditional historical accounts.
Which is really important.
And again, we see that irony in their names. Cunegonde, the chaste one, enduring so much sexual violence.
It highlights the gap between ideals and reality.
Exactly.
Okay, so then we have the incredibly impactful episode of the enslaved man in Suriname.
His story is just devastating. Sold by his own mother, then brutally mutilated by his Dutch master.
It's graphic and hard to hear, but it's a really crucial moment in the story.
The lecture points to this as a very clear example of moral evil, the kind of horrific cruelty that humans are capable of inflicting on each other.
And for Candide, this is a turning point. The enslaved man's complete despair, the way he says he's more miserable than the animals, it shakes Candide to his core.
It's this raw, undeniable suffering that finally shatters his remaining faith in Pangloss's worldview.
He can't ignore it anymore.
Right.
So now the lecture moves on to a seemingly different kind of encounter. Candide and Cacambo's journey to El Dorado in South America.
Ah, El Dorado, the legendary city of gold.
But the lecture points out the irony in the name itself. El Dorado means the man of gold, but in El Dorado, gold is basically worthless.
Right. It has no value.
Which is a really interesting commentary on societal values, because El Dorado is presented as this incredibly pure society. No poverty, no greed. People live long and happy lives.
And they're not concerned with material wealth at all.
But here's the thing. Candide and Cacambo can't quite wrap their heads around it.
They're so used to the old world where gold means everything.
They can't be truly happy in a place where it has no value.
And that's really telling.
Their decision to leave El Dorado, taking as much gold as they can carry.
It really highlights this disconnect between their supposed search for a perfect society and their own materialistic desires.
They're still products of the world they came from.
Exactly.
So even when presented with what seems like a utopia, their old world values prevent them from fully embracing it.
Right.
Then the journey takes another turn. They head east to Turkey, or Constantinople as it was known then.
And here, the lecture introduces this concept of fatalism.
Fatalism.
Like this idea that everything is predetermined. Fate controls everything.
And this was how Eastern societies were perceived at the time.
Well, the lecture highlights that it might have been a bit of a biased Western view. This idea that Eastern cultures were passive and just accepted things like oppressive regimes as their divinely ordained fate.
So it's almost like Voltaire is exploring different answers to the problem of suffering. Now he's looking at this idea of acceptance.
Right, just accepting whatever happens as fate.
Which is a pretty stark contrast to Pangloss's optimistic insistence that everything's for the best.
Exactly. And then we have the encounter with the dervish.
The dervish. Okay, refresh my memory. What's a dervish again?
The lecture describes him as wearing tattered clothes, maybe a bit wild-looking.
Okay, so not exactly a polished philosopher type.
But the lecture emphasizes the wisdom he offers.
So appearances can be deceiving.
Definitely. And the dervish's advice is really interesting. He rejects philosophical debate.
He's not interested in arguing about the meaning of life.
And his advice to Candide and Pangloss is pretty blunt. Keep your mouth shut.
Wow. Straight to the point.
And then he slams the door in their faces.
Talk about a symbolic gesture.
The lecture interprets this as a rejection of all that overthinking.
All the theorizing and grand narratives that Pangloss is so fond of.
It's like Voltaire saying, enough with the talk, just be quiet and observe.
Which is a pretty radical idea, considering how much emphasis the Enlightenment placed on reason and debate.
It is. And then we have the encounter with the old man on the farm.
This is towards the end of the story, right?
Yeah. Candy's been through a lot at this point.
He's pretty disillusioned.
And the old man is this interesting contrast. He's completely removed from all the political chaos and drama of Constantinople.
He's just chilling on his farm, tending his garden.
His philosophy is simple. Cultivate your own garden. That's the key to a peaceful life.
So it's about focusing on what you can control.
Exactly. Practical action over abstract discussion.
Which leads to Candide's final realization. We must cultivate our garden. It's such a simple statement, but it's so powerful.
The lecture interprets it as a shift towards pragmatism, focusing on work, self-improvement, rather than getting lost in all those philosophical debates.
It's about finding meaning in the everyday.
And the lecture even suggests that Voltaire himself might be endorsing this view.
Like he's saying, stop trying to figure out the big unanswerable questions. Just focus on what you can do.
Right.
So as we wrap up this deep dive into Candide, what are the key takeaways from this lecture?
Okay, so we looked at the historical context, the 18th century, this time of great optimism,
Enlightenment.
and the events and ideas that started to challenge that optimism.
Like the Lisbon earthquake.
Exactly. And then we have Voltaire's critique of that optimistic worldview, his use of satire to highlight the harsh realities of the world.
And Candide's journey, both physical and philosophical.
The powerful stories of suffering, especially from those who are marginalized.
And that final message. The importance of practical action. Cultivating our garden. It really makes you think, doesn't it? Because these themes of optimism, suffering, the search for meaning in a world that often feels chaotic, they're still relevant today.
Oh, absolutely.
I mean, don't we see modern-day panglosses all the time? People who cling to these overly optimistic views, even when the evidence suggests otherwise.
Right. What are our contemporary Lisbon earthquakes?
Hmm.
What are those events that shake our comfortable assumptions about the world?
It makes me think about how we often try to rationalize bad things by saying everything happens for a reason.
Right. It's like a modern version of the best of all possible worlds.
So it's something to think about. What's the right balance in our own lives between philosophical inquiry and practical action?
The big question.
If you want to dive deeper into this, we highly recommend reading Candide itself.
It's a quick read, but it's packed with ideas.
And you can also explore the historical context of the Enlightenment.
There are so many resources out there.
Because understanding works like Candide isn't just about history. It's about gaining insights into human nature.
And those insights can be really valuable.
They can stay with you long after you finish reading.
Exactly.
So thanks for joining us on this deep dive. We'll see you next time.
See you then.